The security agent stared at the scanner. Then he froze. For a moment, nobody moved. Not me. Not my father. Not the line of guests waiting to enter the Pentagon. The agent touched his earpiece and lowered his voice. "Clear the route now." 3 more security personnel appeared almost immediately. The casual atmosphere vanished. The conversations around us stopped. People stepped aside. My father blinked twice as if he thought he had misunderstood what he'd heard. I didn't say a word. I simply picked up my identification card and slipped it back into my purse. The agent straightened his posture. "Ma'am, they'll be expecting you upstairs." My father looked from the agent to me and back again. For the first time in my life, he looked genuinely confused. Not angry, not dismissive. Confused. And if you had told me 30 years earlier that this would be the moment that changed everything between us, I would never have believed you. Because for most of my life, I was the daughter nobody expected much from. My name is Evelyn Morgan. I was 56 years old that morning. I had served in the United States Navy for over 3 decades. And yet, standing outside the Pentagon, my own father still believed I was somebody's guest. The funny thing is, I couldn't entirely blame him. For years, I had allowed people to underestimate me. It was easier that way. Easier than explaining. Easier than arguing. Easier than spending every family gathering trying to convince someone that my work mattered. Especially my father. The morning had started quietly enough. Washington, D.C. was wrapped in a cool spring breeze. The sky was clear. The roads were busy. The Pentagon stood exactly as it always had, massive, serious, and strangely familiar. I'd visited countless times over the years, but this visit felt different. Today wasn't about meetings. It wasn't about briefings. And it certainly wasn't about paperwork. Today was a ceremony. A very important one. One that had been years in the making. The official invitation had arrived weeks earlier. The details had remained confidential. Only a handful of people knew exactly why I would be there. My father wasn't one of them. Neither was my older brother. In fact, my family knew almost nothing about my career. Not because I had hidden it. Because they had never really asked. At least not in a way that suggested they wanted an answer. To them, I had spent most of my adult life doing some vague government job. Something military. Something administrative. Something that involved uniforms and offices. Whenever relatives asked what I did, my father usually answered before I could. "Evelyn works for the Navy." That was it. No mention of leadership positions. No mention of deployments. No mention of responsibilities. Just works for the Navy. As if I processed paperwork in a basement somewhere. My brother Daniel didn't help. Daniel owned several successful businesses in Ohio. He drove expensive vehicles, lived in a large house, played golf with local politicians. My father loved that. He understood money. He understood business. He understood visible success. Military service was different. The sacrifices weren't obvious. The accomplishments often couldn't be discussed. The victories rarely came with newspaper headlines. And so over time I became easy to overlook. Not hated. Not mistreated. Just overlooked. Sometimes that can hurt even more. I learned that lesson long ago. When I was young, I spent years trying to earn my father's approval. I'd call after promotions. He'd change the subject. I'd tell him about new assignments. He'd ask how Daniel's company was doing. I'd come home in uniform. He'd barely notice. After enough years, you stop expecting recognition. You stop chasing validation. You learn to build your life without it. At least that's what I told myself. The truth was more complicated. A small part of me never stopped hoping. Even at 56 years old. Even after decades of service. Even after all the places I'd been. That small part still wanted my father to see me. Really see me. As I approached the Pentagon entrance that morning, I spotted him immediately. He was standing near Daniel. Both wore dark suits. Both looked completely comfortable. Daniel was talking. My father was laughing. Then he saw me. The smile on his face changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. The familiar expression I'd seen my entire life. The one that said he was already making assumptions. I walked toward the security checkpoint. He stepped forward. "Who invited you here?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. A few nearby guests glanced our way. I met his eyes. "Nobody." His grin widened. There it was. That look. The one that said he thought he'd caught me in something. "Let me guess," he said. "You're somebody's +1. Daniel chuckled beside him. I could have answered. I could have explained. I could have told them the truth. Instead, I simply smiled. Then I stepped toward the scanner. Because after 30 years in the Navy, I'd learned something important. People rarely change their minds because of arguments. They change their minds because reality leaves them no choice. The scanner beeped. The agent examined the screen, and everything changed. Now, as I followed the escort through secured hallways, I could still picture my father's face. The confusion, the uncertainty, the first crack in a belief he'd carried for decades. The Pentagon corridors stretched ahead of me. Military personnel moved with purpose. Civilian officials passed by carrying folders and tablets. The building felt alive, focused, important. And for the first time all morning, I allowed myself a slow breath. The ceremony wouldn't begin for another hour. A lot could happen before then. My father still had no idea why I was here. No idea what was waiting inside. And no idea that before this day was over, he would finally learn the truth about the daughter he had spent 30 years underestimating. As the Pentagon escort led me through the secure corridor, memories surfaced that I hadn't thought about in years. Funny how that happens. You spend decades pushing certain feelings aside, convincing yourself you've moved on. Then one look from your father can bring everything rushing back. The hallway opened into a waiting area reserved for ceremony participants. A Navy captain greeted me warmly and offered coffee. I thanked him and sat near a window overlooking part of the Pentagon complex. For a few quiet minutes, I found myself thinking about Ohio, about where all of this had started. I grew up in a small town outside Columbus. Nothing extraordinary. Tree-lined streets, Friday night football games, church on Sundays, neighbors who knew each other's names. My father, Richard Morgan, worked hard his entire life. He owned a small construction company and built a respectable reputation in the community. People trusted him, respected him, looked up to him. When I was a little girl, I looked up to him too. Truthfully, I adored him. I wanted his approval more than anything. My mother used to laugh because I followed him everywhere. If he repaired a fence, I wanted to help. If he worked in the garage, I sat nearby and watched. If he drove somewhere, I begged to go along. Back then, I believed he could do anything. But as I got older, subtle differences began to appear, especially between how he treated me and how he treated my brother. Daniel was 3 years older than me. Confident, outgoing, naturally charming. People gravitated toward him. My father certainly did. When Daniel scored a touchdown, Dad celebrated for days. When Daniel won student awards, the certificates went on display. When Daniel started talking about business ideas in high school, Dad listened as though he were speaking with a future millionaire. Meanwhile, I was quieter, more thoughtful, more interested in service than success. I earned good grades, worked hard, stayed out of trouble. But those things never seemed quite as exciting. I remember one conversation during my senior year of high school. It stayed with me for decades. I had just received acceptance into a respected ROTC program. I was thrilled. The opportunity felt enormous. I sat at the kitchen table waiting for my father to come home. The moment he walked through the door, I handed him the letter. He read it carefully, then looked at me. "That's nice," he said. "Nice." That was all. The next day, Daniel mentioned a used truck he wanted to buy for a landscaping business he hoped to start. My father spent 2 hours discussing plans with him. I sat quietly nearby. Something shifted inside me that day. Not anger, not jealousy. Just understanding. For whatever reason, my dreams didn't excite him the way Daniel's did. Years later, when I joined the Navy, the pattern continued. I remember graduation from officer candidate school. My mother cried. My father shook my hand. Actually shook my hand. As if I were a coworker, not his daughter. I told myself that was simply his way. Some people aren't emotional. Some people struggle to express pride. I made excuses because I wanted to believe the best about him. For many years, those excuses helped. Then came my first overseas assignment. Then another. Then another. The world became larger than I ever imagined. I served alongside remarkable people. Men and women who gave up holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, and family milestones because duty required it. I learned what sacrifice really looked like. I learned leadership, responsibility, accountability. I learned how quickly life can change. After the attacks of September 11th, 2001, everything intensified. The military changed. The country changed. And so did many of us who wore the uniform. I volunteered for assignments that took me far from home. Some were difficult. Some were dangerous. Most were demanding. I won't pretend I was a hero. There were countless others who sacrificed far more than I did. But I showed up, every day, for decades. And through all those years, family gatherings remained strangely predictable. Whenever I came home, conversations centered around Daniel, his newest business venture, his latest investment, his bigger house, his newer car, his growing success. Meanwhile, people ask me questions like, "So are you still in the Navy?" As if it were a temporary summer job. One Thanksgiving stands out in my memory. I had recently been promoted. A significant milestone, one I'd worked years to achieve. The promotion carried enormous responsibility. I was proud of it. Not because of the title, because of what it represented. My father never mentioned it. Not once. That same evening, Daniel announced he was opening another office location. Dad raised a glass. Everyone applauded. I smiled and applauded too. Then I helped clear dishes from the table. On the drive back to my hotel, I remember feeling something I rarely allowed myself to feel. Loneliness. Not because I was physically alone. Because I felt invisible. That feeling followed me for years. Yet I never stopped showing up. Birthdays. Christmases. Family reunions. Retirement parties. I attended whenever duty allowed. And every time I hoped things might be different. Sometimes they were. For a few minutes. Then conversations drifted back toward Daniel. Back toward business. Back toward money. Back toward the things my father understood best. Eventually, I stopped expecting recognition. Or at least I thought I had. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. The Pentagon captain stepped into the waiting room. "Ma'am, they'll be ready for you shortly." I nodded. "Thank you." After he left, I looked down at my phone. There was a text message from my mother. Only one sentence. "Your father is very confused." I couldn't help smiling. For the first time in years, confusion might actually be useful. Because in less than an hour, my father would hear things he'd never heard before. Not secrets. Not classified information. Just the truth. The truth about where I'd been, what I'd done, and who I had become while he was busy looking somewhere else. Outside the waiting room, preparations for the ceremony continued. Guests were arriving. Officials were gathering. Military leaders were taking their seats, and somewhere inside the Pentagon, a program booklet already contained my name. My father just hadn't seen it yet. The waiting room door opened precisely at 10 o'clock. A civilian aide stepped inside and smiled. "Ma'am, we're ready for you." I stood, straightened my jacket, and followed her into the corridor. The closer we got to the ceremony hall, the more familiar faces I saw. Some I knew well. Others I recognized only by reputation. Senior military officers. Department leaders. Career public servants. People whose names rarely appeared in newspapers, but whose decisions affected thousands of lives. As we approached the entrance, several conversations paused. A few people nodded. Others walked over to shake my hand. "Good to see you again, Evelyn." "Congratulations." "Well deserved." I thanked each of them politely. Nothing more. Nothing less. Years in uniform had taught me that public recognition should be handled with humility. Besides, the ceremony wasn't why my mind kept drifting elsewhere. My thoughts were still outside. With my father. Because for the first time in my life, he was witnessing something he couldn't immediately explain. And I suspected that made him uncomfortable. The aide guided me to a reserved section near the front of the auditorium. Rows of seats stretched across the large room. Flags stood behind the stage. A military band quietly prepared in the corner. The atmosphere felt formal but not theatrical. This wasn't a political event. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It was the kind of ceremony that happened every day across the military, important to those involved, largely unnoticed by everyone else. I sat down and glanced around. A few seats away, a retired admiral offered a friendly smile. We'd worked together years earlier. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. Some relationships are built through long hours, difficult decisions, and mutual trust. Words become less necessary. As guests continued arriving, my phone vibrated once. A text from my mother. "They're asking questions." I smiled. That sounded about right. Outside the ceremony hall, I could easily imagine what was happening. My father hated uncertainty. Always had. For most of his life, he had been the person with answers. The one in charge. The one who understood how things worked. Now suddenly he was standing inside the Pentagon watching security personnel escort his daughter through restricted areas. That didn't fit the story he'd been telling himself for 30 years. And when reality doesn't match our assumptions, discomfort usually follows. Later, I would learn exactly what happened after I entered the building. My mother told me everything. Apparently, my father and Daniel spent the next 20 minutes trying to figure out why security had reacted the way they did. At first, they assumed it was a mistake. "There must be another Evelyn Morgan," Daniel reportedly said. My mother didn't respond. Then they speculated that perhaps I was assisting someone important. Maybe I worked for a senior officer. Maybe I coordinated events. Maybe I handled logistics. Anything seemed more believable to them than the truth. The truth had never crossed their minds. My father even joked that the Pentagon probably had special procedures for long-term employees. "She's probably been pushing paperwork there for years," he said. According to my mother, she finally looked at him and asked, "Do you actually know what your daughter does?" That question apparently ended the conversation, because the honest answer was no, he didn't. Not really. Meanwhile, inside the auditorium, the program continued to fill. The seat beside me remained empty until a distinguished-looking Air Force general arrived. He sat down, turned toward me, and smiled warmly. "Evelyn, General, I was hoping you'd be here early." We exchanged a few pleasantries. Nothing unusual, at least not to me. But several nearby attendees noticed. I could see it in their expressions. Military communities are surprisingly small. People pay attention, especially when senior leaders treat someone as a peer. A few minutes later, another familiar face approached. Then another. A retired undersecretary, a Navy vice admiral, a civilian director from the Department of Defense. Each stopped briefly. Each offered congratulations. Each moved on. To me, it felt normal. To someone observing from a distance, it might have looked very different. I imagined my father's reaction if he could see it. The thought made me uneasy, not because I wanted revenge, because I didn't. Despite everything, I still loved my father. That was the complicated part. People often assume family disappointments turn into hatred. Most of the time they don't. Most of the time they turn into sadness. A quiet sadness that settles into the corners of your life. You continue loving people while wishing they had loved you differently. That's far harder than anger. The auditorium doors opened again. Guests entered steadily. Among them, I finally spotted my family. My father, my mother, Daniel, several relatives who had traveled from Ohio. An usher guided them toward their assigned seats. My father scanned the room. At first, he didn't see me. Then his eyes found the reserved section. I watched his expression change. He froze for a second. Not dramatically, just enough, because the seats near me weren't ordinary seats. They were reserved for ceremony participants, senior officials, and invited leadership. My father clearly noticed. Daniel noticed too. They exchanged a look. I almost knew what they were thinking. There must be some explanation. There always had been before. My father sat down slowly. Even from across the room, I could see the uncertainty growing. For years, he had confidently explained my life to everyone around him. Now the evidence in front of him was creating cracks in that confidence. The military band began playing softly. Conversation settled. The room gradually quieted. On-stage officials reviewed final notes. The ceremony would begin shortly. I glanced down at the printed program resting on my lap. Near the center was a list of award recipients. My name appeared among them. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just black ink on white paper. Yet somehow those simple words represented 32 years of service. Thousands of days. Countless sacrifices, moments nobody in my family had ever fully seen. I looked toward my father one more time. He was reading the same program. Slowly, carefully, his eyes moving line by line, then suddenly stopping. For the first time all morning, genuine concern appeared on his face, because he had finally found my name. And it wasn't where he expected it to be. The ceremony hadn't even started. Yet the story he had believed for decades was already beginning to fall apart. The ceremony began with the usual formalities. The colors were presented. The national anthem was performed. Everyone stood. Then everyone sat again. The room settled into a respectful silence. I had attended hundreds of military ceremonies throughout my career. Promotions, retirements, command changes, award presentations, memorial services. Most followed a familiar rhythm. This one was no different, at least not on the surface. From where I sat, I could see my family several rows behind the reserved section. My mother looked calm. She always did. My father looked increasingly uncomfortable. Daniel looked confused. That combination almost made me smile. Almost. The senior Pentagon official stepped to the podium and welcomed everyone. He spoke about service, commitment, leadership, the responsibilities that come with protecting a nation. His words were thoughtful and sincere. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing political. Just an honest reflection on what military service asks of people. As he spoke, I found myself thinking about all the men and women I'd worked beside over the years. Some had retired. Some had moved on to civilian careers. Some were no longer with us. I thought about late nights, long deployments, missed anniversaries, missed birthdays, missed funerals. The sacrifices rarely appeared in official citations, but they were real, very real. The official continued. Several awards were presented first. Individuals walked to the stage. Families applauded. Photographs were taken. Then the program reached the section I had been waiting for. The room grew quieter. The official looked down at his notes. This next recognition honors an individual whose contributions have had a lasting impact across multiple commands, multiple administrations, and multiple generations of military leadership. I felt my heartbeat slow, not speed up, slow down. The strange calm that comes when a moment you've anticipated for years finally arrives. The official continued reading. The recipient has dedicated more than 3 decades to the United States Navy and the Department of Defense. My father straightened in his chair. I noticed it immediately. So did my mother. His eyes moved toward the stage, then toward the program, then back again. Their work has influenced strategic readiness, leadership development, and operational effectiveness throughout the fleet. The room remained silent. Every word seemed to hang in the air. Their commitment to service has shaped countless careers and strengthened the institutions they were entrusted to serve. I heard someone nearby shift in their seat, a cough somewhere in the back, then silence again. The official smiled. It is my privilege to recognize Rear Admiral Evelyn Morgan. For a moment nobody moved. At least that's how it felt. Then the room erupted into applause. I stood. The sound became louder, much louder. People rose from their seats. Not everyone, but many. Enough that I immediately felt embarrassed. I've never been comfortable being the center of attention. Military culture tends to discourage it. You learn to focus on the mission rather than yourself. Yet there I was, standing, listening to the applause, trying not to think about the fact that my father was witnessing all of it. As I walked toward the stage, I glanced briefly in his direction. The expression on his face is something I will never forget. It wasn't shock anymore. It wasn't confusion. It was realization. The kind that arrives all at once, like a door suddenly opening. For 30 years he had believed he understood my life. Now he was discovering he had only seen a fraction of it. I reached the stage. The official shook my hand. Photographs were taken. The audience gradually settled. Then came the citation. The part that changed everything. The official began reading highlights from my career. Assignments, leadership roles, strategic initiatives, programs I had helped build, teams I had led, organizations I had served. The words themselves weren't dramatic, but together they painted a picture my family had never seen. A career. A real one. A meaningful one. Not a vague government job. Not administrative busywork. Not somebody else's supporting role. My own. Years of effort. Years of responsibility. Years of sacrifice. As the citation continued, I noticed my father wasn't blinking much. He stared at the stage as if afraid he might miss something. The details seemed to hit him one after another. The deployments. The leadership appointments. The national-level responsibilities. The awards. The recognition. Every fact challenged an assumption he'd carried for decades. And perhaps the hardest realization of all was this. None of it had happened overnight. None of it was recent. These achievements represented years, sometimes decades, which meant the truth had always been there. He simply hadn't looked closely enough to see it. The citation finally concluded. The audience applauded again. I accepted the recognition and stepped back from the podium. Then something unexpected happened. The official smiled and said, "Admiral Morgan, would you care to say a few words?" I hadn't prepared a speech, at least not a formal one. Still, I stepped forward. The room quieted. I looked out across the audience, at colleagues, friends, leaders, family. Then I spoke. I've spent most of my career working alongside people who rarely receive public recognition. The room listened. I've learned that service isn't about titles. It isn't about awards. It isn't about applause. I paused. It's about showing up every day and doing the job you're entrusted to do. A few heads nodded. I continued. No accomplishment belongs to one person. Every success in my career came because others taught me, trusted me, challenged me, and supported me. My eyes drifted briefly toward my family. Not long enough for anyone else to notice. Just long enough for me. And for that, I'll always be grateful. The applause that followed felt warmer than before. More personal. I stepped away from the microphone. The ceremony continued. But my father's attention never left me. Not once, because something had shifted. The daughter he thought he knew no longer matched the woman standing before him. And for the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand just how much he had missed. The ceremony ended just before noon. People began standing. Programs were folded. Conversations resumed. Military officers shook hands and exchanged congratulations. Guests slowly filtered toward the reception area outside the auditorium. For a few minutes I remained where I was. Not because I wanted attention. Actually, the opposite. I needed a moment to breathe. The morning had been emotionally exhausting in ways I hadn't expected. Recognition never bothered me. Family did. Family always did. A retired admiral stopped to congratulate me. Then a civilian director. Then 2 officers I had mentored years earlier. Each conversation was kind, brief, respectful. Eventually the crowd began thinning, and that's when I saw them. My family, standing near the rear of the room, waiting. My mother looked emotional. Daniel looked uncomfortable. My father looked older. Not physically, just heavier somehow, like the morning had placed a weight on his shoulders. For a second nobody moved. Then my mother walked forward first. She wrapped her arms around me. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. Simple words, yet they carried more meaning than she probably realized. I hugged her back. "Thank you, Mom." When we separated, Daniel stepped forward. For once, he didn't have a joke ready. No clever comment. No casual confidence. Just honesty. "Wow," I laughed softly. "That's all you've got?" He shook his head. "No," he looked down briefly. Then back at me. I had no idea. There was no sarcasm in his voice. No resentment. Just genuine surprise. I nodded. Most people didn't. Daniel let out a long breath. I guess I should have asked more questions. Maybe. The truth was, Daniel had never been intentionally cruel. Self-centered at times. Sure. Oblivious. Definitely. But not cruel. My father was different. Not because he was a bad man. Because his disappointment carried more weight. His approval always had. And now he stood a few feet away staring at me as though he wasn't quite sure where to begin. Finally he spoke. "Evelyn." Just my name. Nothing else. I waited. He swallowed hard, then looked around the nearly empty auditorium. The flags. The stage. The people still stopping to greet me. His eyes returned to mine. "I didn't know." The words came out quietly, almost fragile. For a moment I said nothing, because the truth was complicated. Part of me wanted to accept the apology immediately. Another part wanted to ask 100 questions. Why didn't you know? Why didn't you ask? Why didn't you listen? Why was everybody else's success easier for you to see than mine? Those questions had lived inside me for years. But standing there looking at my 78-year-old father, they suddenly seemed less important. Not unimportant. Just less important. Because I could already see the answers on his face. Regret. Real regret. And regret is a painful thing, especially when it arrives late. "I know," I said. He nodded slowly. Then something happened that I never expected. My father apologized. Not the kind of apology people offer to end an uncomfortable conversation. Not the kind that shifts blame. A real apology. I should have paid attention. The words came carefully. I should have listened more. His voice wavered slightly. "I thought I knew what your life looked like." He shook his head. I didn't. The room felt strangely quiet. Daniel looked away. My mother wiped at her eyes. I simply stood there listening. Because for years this was all I'd wanted. Not praise, not recognition, not even approval. Just honesty. My father took a deep breath. "When you were younger, I always thought success looked a certain way. I already knew what he meant. Money, business, visibility. The things he understood. The things Daniel represented." He continued. I could see Daniel's success. A sad smile crossed his face. It was easy. He looked directly at me. "Yours was different." I didn't respond. He wasn't finished. "You'd disappear for months." He laughed bitterly. "You couldn't talk about half of what you were doing." I nodded. That was true. Many assignments came with restrictions. Sometimes I couldn't discuss details even with family. It became easier to assume you were doing the same thing you'd always been doing. He looked around again. And today I realized how wrong I was. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then he asked something that surprised me. "Were there other ceremonies?" I blinked. "What?" "Promotions." His voice was quieter now. "Awards." He looked embarrassed. "Things I should have attended." The question hit harder than I expected. Because suddenly I remembered all of them. The promotion where only my mother came. The command ceremony where I scanned the audience looking for him. The retirement celebration of a mentor I'd wanted him to meet. The moments I'd quietly hoped would matter. And the moments he'd missed. There were a few, I admitted. His eyes lowered. That answer hurt him. I could see it. Good. Not because I wanted him to suffer. Because sometimes pain is necessary. Sometimes it's the price of understanding. A long silence followed. Then my father looked up again. I can't change any of that. No, I wish I could. For the first time all day I smiled. I know. And I did. That's what made the difference. Years earlier I might have doubted him. Not anymore. People can hide many things. But genuine regret isn't one of them. Eventually the conversation shifted. The tension eased. We walked together toward the reception area. Not as adversaries. Not as strangers. Just as family. Damaged family. Imperfect family. But family nonetheless. As we moved through the hallway, several people stopped to speak with me. My father watched each interaction carefully. Not with jealousy. Not with confusion. With curiosity. For perhaps the first time in his life he wanted to learn who his daughter actually was. And strangely enough, that mattered more than the award itself. Because all morning I had imagined a kind of revenge, not public humiliation, not triumph, just vindication. Proof. Yet standing beside my father I realized something. The best revenge wasn't making him feel small. The best revenge was becoming someone he could no longer ignore. And the greatest victory wasn't proving him wrong. It was giving him the chance to finally see the truth. 3 weeks after the ceremony my father called me. Not a text. Not a message passed through my mother. An actual phone call. That alone was unusual. For most of my adult life our conversations had been brief. Polite. Predictable. The kind of conversations people have when they care about each other, but don't quite know how to connect. When I answered there was a long pause. Then he said something that would have sounded ordinary to anyone else. Do you have time for lunch? I smiled. Sure. That simple lunch became the beginning of something neither of us expected. We met at a small diner halfway between our homes. Nothing fancy. The same kind of place where retired veterans drank coffee for hours, and everybody seemed to know the waitress by name. My father arrived early. I could tell he was nervous. He kept adjusting his coffee cup, looking around, clearing his throat. Finally, he leaned forward. Tell me about your career. I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny, because I had waited 30 years to hear those words. 30 years. Most people don't realize how much time that is until they look backward. 30 years of holidays, birthdays, promotions, challenges, victories, failures. 30 years of life. And now my father wanted to hear about it. So I told him. Not everything. Some stories belonged to other people. Some remained confidential. But I shared what I could. The places I'd served. The leaders I'd worked with. The lessons I'd learned. The mistakes I'd made. The people who shaped me. The mentors who guided me. The sailors who inspired me. For nearly 2 hours he listened. Really listened. He asked questions. Follow-up questions. The kind of questions people ask when they genuinely care about the answers. By the end of lunch, something had changed. Not dramatically. Not magically. Relationships don't heal that way. But a door had opened, and neither of us wanted to close it. Over the following weeks, those conversations continued. Sometimes by phone. Sometimes in person. For the first time in years, my father seemed interested in understanding rather than assuming. One afternoon, he asked to see old photographs. I brought several albums. Pictures from deployments, command ceremonies, retirement celebrations, training exercises. He studied every image carefully. At one point, he picked up a photograph taken nearly 15 years earlier. I was standing beside a group of sailors after a major achievement. Everyone in the picture was smiling. My father stared at it for a long time. Then he quietly said, "You look happy." I nodded. "I was?" He continued looking at the photograph. "I never saw these." "No." He shook his head slowly. "I missed a lot." There wasn't much I could say to that. Because he was right. He had missed a lot. And so had I. That realization hurt both of us. Yet somehow it also brought us closer. Acknowledging the loss allowed us to stop pretending it never happened. As summer arrived, our family gathered for a cookout at my parents' house. Nothing special. Just burgers. Hot dogs. Potato salad. Grandchildren running through the yard. The kind of afternoon millions of American families enjoy every year. No uniforms. No speeches. No Pentagon. No awards. Just family. Exactly the way it should be. At one point, I stepped inside the house to refill a pitcher of iced tea. As I walked through the kitchen, I heard voices coming from the living room. My father was talking to 2 of my grandchildren. I stopped when I heard my name. Not because I intended to eavesdrop, because something in his tone caught my attention. One of the kids had apparently asked about a photograph displayed on the shelf. A recent picture from the Pentagon ceremony. My father picked it up. Then he said something I'll never forget. Your grandmother spent more than 30 years serving this country. His voice carried quiet pride, the kind I'd wanted to hear since childhood. The children listened attentively. My father continued. She worked harder than most people realize. He smiled. And she helped a lot of people along the way. The kids nodded. One of them asked, was she important? My father laughed softly. Then came the answer that meant more to me than any award ever could. Yes. A brief pause followed, but not because of her rank. He looked down at the photograph, because she showed up every day and did the job the right way. I stood there silently, holding a pitcher of tea, trying not to cry. Because after all the years of disappointment, after all the years of misunderstanding, after all the years of feeling invisible, my father finally understood. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. And sometimes enough is a miracle. Later that evening, as the sun began setting, we sat together on the back porch. The grandchildren played in the yard. Fireflies flickered in the distance. The air felt warm and peaceful. My father looked out across the lawn. You know, he said quietly, I thought success was something people could see. I listened. He smiled sadly. I was wrong. I didn't answer immediately. Then I said, we all get things wrong. He nodded. Yeah. After a moment he added, thank you for giving me another chance. I looked at him. The man who had disappointed me. The man who had shaped me. The man who had finally found the courage to admit his mistakes. And I realized something. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It doesn't rewrite old memories. It doesn't undo missed opportunities. What forgiveness does is allow the future to be different. That was enough for me. Maybe that's the lesson hidden inside this story. Many of the people around us are carrying accomplishments, sacrifices, and struggles we know nothing about. We assume. We judge. We place people into neat little boxes. Sometimes we do it for years. But every person has a story. And often the most remarkable stories belong to the people we underestimate. My father thought I arrived at the Pentagon as somebody's guest. What neither of us understood was that I had spent 30 years earning my own invitation. And in the end, the greatest victory wasn't the award. It wasn't the recognition. It wasn't proving anyone wrong. It was coming home with my family still intact. If this story reminded you of someone you've underestimated or someone who never stopped believing in you, I hope you'll take a moment to think about them today. And if you've ever had to earn respect the hard way, I'd love for you to share your experience. Your story may encourage someone else more than you realize. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if you'd like to hear more stories about family resilience, forgiveness, and second chances, I hope you'll join us again. No attorney, the judge asked me. The courtroom smelled like old paper-burnt coffee and floor polish. It was one of those county courtrooms that hadn't changed much since the 1980s. Brown wooden benches, buzzing fluorescent lights, an old American flag standing beside the judge's bench. My younger brother Daniel leaned back in his chair and laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. She can't afford one. A couple people in the gallery smirked. My father nodded proudly beside him like Daniel had just said something clever. I stood alone at the defense table wearing an old beige coat I'd bought years ago in Norfolk after my husband died. I could feel every eye in that room studying me, judging me. A 63-year-old widow with gray streaks in her hair and no lawyer. Easy target. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked at me again. Ma'am, this is a serious civil proceeding involving inheritance fraud allegations. Are you certain you wish to represent yourself? Daniel chuckled under his breath. She always was stubborn. I looked at my brother for a long moment. Funny how age changes faces but not character. Daniel was 58 now. His hair was thinner, his stomach heavier, but the smug little grin he wore when we were children was still there. The same grin he wore after blaming me for breaking Dad's fishing radio when he'd done it himself. The same grin he wore after stealing money from Mom's purse in high school. The same grin he wore now. I slowly removed my coat and folded it neatly over the table. Then I looked directly at their attorney. Who signed your security clearance? The courtroom went silent. Not quiet, silent. Their attorney stopped breathing for a second. The color drained from his face so fast I actually thought he might faint. The judge noticed immediately. Mr. Talbot, he asked carefully. Daniel looked confused. What the hell does that even mean? He laughed. But his attorney wasn't laughing anymore. He stared at me with the exact same expression I'd seen on young naval officers years ago when they accidentally opened the wrong classified file. Fear mixed with recognition. I sat down calmly. And for the first time that morning, nobody in that courtroom looked at me like a helpless old woman. Not even my father. 3 months earlier, I had been standing in my kitchen overlooking the Chesapeake Bay when the lawsuit papers arrived. Rain tapped against the windows that afternoon. The kind of slow Virginia rain that settles into your bones. I remember heating tomato soup on the stove when the mail carrier knocked. Certified envelope. County seal. Inside was a lawsuit filed by my own brother accusing me of manipulating our late mother into changing her will while she suffered from dementia. I must have read the papers 6 times. My hands didn't even shake at first. That came later. After 40 years working around military investigations, you learn to stay calm during shock. Your body delays the reaction until it's alone. I sat at my kitchen table until sunset, staring at Daniel's signature at the bottom of the complaint. My own brother. The boy whose diapers I changed when Mom worked late shifts at the diner. The teenager I covered for after he got drunk and wrapped Dad's truck around a mailbox in 1983. The grown man I loaned nearly $30,000 to over the years without ever asking for repayment. Now he wanted me destroyed in court. The strangest part wasn't even the lawsuit. It was my father supporting him. That hurt worse. Dad was 86 now. Arthritis in both hands, heart trouble, hearing aid in his left ear. After Mom passed, Daniel practically moved into his house full-time. At first I thought it was kindness, then I realized it was control. Dad stopped answering my calls regularly. When I visited, Daniel somehow always managed to be there, and every conversation became uncomfortable. "You sure stayed gone a long time," Dad told me once while staring at the television instead of me. I'd stood there holding grocery bags in both hands like some unwanted guest. I was serving Dad. That was all he said. 40 years reduced to The truth is, my father never forgave me for joining the Navy. Not really. He came from an older generation, Korean War generation, men who believed daughters stayed close to home. My mother understood me. Dad never did. When I enlisted in 1979, he acted like I'd abandoned the family. Meanwhile, Daniel stayed in Virginia close to home, close to Dad. That made him the good son. Didn't matter how many failed businesses he started. Didn't matter how much money disappeared over the years. Didn't matter how many lies Mom quietly covered for. He stayed. And in my father's mind, staying counted more than sacrifice. After my husband Frank died from pancreatic cancer 6 years ago, I finally retired from Naval Intelligence Logistics Consulting and came home for good. Not to fight. Not to prove anything. I just got tired of hotel rooms, government buildings, and lonely mornings. I thought maybe at 63 family mattered more than old resentments. I was wrong. The first sign came during Mom's final year alive. She started calling me late at night. Not emotional calls. Careful ones. Quiet. "Daniel's handling the finances now," she whispered once. I remember sitting on my porch listening to frogs down by the water. "Okay." He gets upset when I ask questions. Something in her voice bothered me. Fear. My mother was never fearful. Another night she called asking if property taxes could really increase that much in 1 year. I checked county records the next morning. They hadn't. That was the moment I started paying attention. But by then, Mom's health was failing fast. And Daniel controlled almost everything around her, including access. The last Thanksgiving before she died still haunts me. Mom looked exhausted sitting at the dinner table. Dad barely spoke to me. Daniel spent the entire evening talking about how hard caregiving had been for him, like he was campaigning for sainthood. Then Mom reached under the table and squeezed my hand. Tiny gesture. Weak fingers, but deliberate. When I looked at her, she gave me this look I still can't explain properly. Almost like apology. Almost like warning. 3 months later, she was gone. And 2 weeks after the funeral, Daniel filed the lawsuit. I remember sitting alone afterward, staring at the Chesapeake water outside my window, thinking something I never thought I'd think about my own family. This lawsuit was never about money. It was punishment. Punishment for leaving. Punishment for succeeding somewhere they couldn't follow. Punishment for becoming someone my father never understood. And sitting there in that courtroom now, watching Daniel grin across the aisle while Dad silently approved, I realized something else. They truly believed I would stand there defenseless. They had no idea who I used to be. The silence inside that courtroom lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt much longer. Their attorney, Richard Talbot, slowly lowered the folder in his hands and stared at me across the room like he was trying to place a face from a nightmare. Judge Holloway noticed immediately. "Mr. Talbot," he repeated. Talbot cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I'd like a brief moment with my client." Daniel looked irritated. "For what, she's bluffing." Talbot didn't even look at him. That was the first crack. Small, but visible. Judge Holloway studied me carefully over the rim of his glasses. He was probably around 70 himself. Silver hair, navy blue tie, calm voice, the kind of old-school judge who believed manners still mattered. 5 minutes, he said finally. The gavel tapped once. Everybody stood. The room exploded into whispers. I stayed seated. At my age, you learn there's no point rushing anywhere, especially not toward conflict. Daniel followed his attorney near the back wall, visibly annoyed. "What is wrong with you?" I heard him hiss. Talbot spoke so quietly I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the fear. And fear has a language of its own. My father remained seated on the wooden bench behind Daniel's table. His shoulders looked smaller than I remembered. Old age had finally caught him over the last couple years. For a moment he looked at me, not angrily, not warmly either, just uncertain. That may have hurt more than hatred, because uncertainty meant he no longer knew who I was. The truth is, most people never really knew what I did in the Navy. That was intentional. Even Frank, my husband, only knew pieces, not because I didn't trust him. Because compartmentalization becomes second nature after enough years around classified systems. You stop talking automatically. You learn silence the way normal people learn small talk. Back in the early 1980s, when I first entered Naval Intelligence Logistics Support, I was mostly handling transportation authorizations, secure communications routing, and contractor documentation. Boring on paper. That's how government work usually looks from the outside. But over time, I moved into security compliance investigations involving defense contractors and overseas supply coordination during the Gulf War years. Nothing glamorous. No Hollywood nonsense. Mostly long nights, bad coffee, endless reports, and people lying about money. People think intelligence work is guns and car chases. Most of it is paperwork. Very dangerous paperwork. One missing signature can compromise an operation. One dishonest contractor can cost lives. I learned early that corruption rarely looks dramatic at first. Usually it starts with somebody quietly changing numbers nobody expects others to check. That lesson stayed with me long after retirement, including when I started noticing strange financial patterns around my mother's accounts. Talbot approached the bench after recess ended. His voice sounded tighter now. "Your Honor, before proceeding, I would request clarification regarding the defendant's prior federal affiliations." Daniel groaned loudly. "Oh, come on." Judge Holloway folded his hands. "Ms. Whitaker." I opened my leather folder slowly and removed a sealed document packet. 20 years ago, those packets used to travel inside locked diplomatic cases. Now they mostly sat untouched in my filing cabinet beside old tax returns and insurance papers. Funny how ordinary classified history becomes after retirement. I handed the packet to the bailiff. The judge opened it carefully. His expression changed almost immediately. Not shock. Recognition. Professional recognition. The kind older servicemen sometimes give each other at airports without saying a word. Daniel looked around impatiently. "What is this seriously?" Nobody answered him. Judge Holloway continued reading silently for nearly a minute. The courtroom had become so quiet I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Finally, the judge looked up. "Ms. Whitaker," he said carefully, "you previously held federal clearance authorization connected to naval intelligence compliance operations." "Yes, Your Honor." "Until your retirement in 2018. "Yes." Talbot looked physically uncomfortable now. Daniel laughed nervously. "So what, she shuffled military paperwork for 30 years. The judge did not smile. And that bothered Daniel. You could see it. Because men like my brother survive on reading social signals. The second the room stops validating them, they panic. Dad shifted uneasily on the bench. His eyes moved between me and the judge, confusion spreading slowly across his face. I almost pitied him. Almost. The truth was, my father built an entire emotional version of me over 40 years. A selfish daughter who left home chasing career ambitions. A woman who chose government work over family dinners. A sister who disappeared during birthdays and anniversaries because work came first. He never understood that missing holidays wasn't ambition. It was duty. Sometimes we were activated without notice. Sometimes travel restrictions prevented communication. Sometimes operations overseas became unstable overnight. You learn not to explain. You simply go. And eventually people stop asking where you've been. Frank understood better than anyone. He was Coast Guard before becoming a civilian harbor inspector. Quiet man, good man. We met in Norfolk in 1987. He once told me people only understand sacrifice when they can see it. That stayed with me, because invisible sacrifice confuses people, especially family. Talbot finally cleared his throat again. "Your Honor, My firm had prior indirect interaction with an investigation tied to Miss Whitaker's office during a contractor audit in 1994. Daniel blinked. What does that mean? Talbot hesitated. It means I recognize her credentials. For the first time all morning, Daniel stopped looking confident. Not scared yet, but unsettled. Judge Holloway leaned back slowly. Interesting. I could feel eyes all over the courtroom now. Curiosity replacing mockery. But I didn't feel triumphant. That's the strange thing people misunderstand about revenge. Real revenge rarely feels exciting. Mostly it feels exhausting, especially when family is involved. The judge reopened the inheritance file. Now he said calmly, let us continue regarding the allegations of financial manipulation against Ms. Whitaker. Daniel straightened quickly, eager to regain control. Yes, Your Honor. My mother was confused near the end. My sister isolated her and pressured her into changing the will. I looked directly at my brother. When exactly did Mom become confused, Daniel? He frowned. What? You said she was mentally compromised. She was. I nodded slowly. Then why did you allow her to sign 3 separate refinancing documents 6 months earlier? The room went still again. Daniel's face tightened instantly. Tiny reaction, but enough. Talbot closed his eyes briefly like a man realizing the floor beneath him might collapse. Dad looked confused. Refinancing, he muttered softly. Daniel turned around too fast. Dad, don't worry about that. But now Judge Holloway was paying very close attention. What refinancing documents, he asked. I opened another folder, and that was the moment I realized something important. Daniel came into this courtroom expecting humiliation. He never expected resistance. Worse, he never expected documentation. Judge Holloway removed his glasses slowly. What refinancing documents? I slid the papers across the table toward the bailiff. The courtroom had changed completely now. Earlier, people looked at me like I was some lonely widow about to lose everything. Now nobody moved. Nobody whispered. Even Daniel noticed it. And he hated it. These documents, I said, calmly show that 6 months before my mother passed away, my brother helped her refinance a portion of the family property. Dad frowned from the gallery bench. Refinance. Daniel turned immediately. It was temporary, Dad. But his voice cracked slightly. That tiny crack told me everything. Judge Holloway studied the paperwork carefully. Mr. Whitaker, he said, these forms carry your mother's signature. Yes, Daniel answered quickly. She agreed to it. I folded my hands together. Then, she was mentally competent enough to sign loan agreements worth over $200,000. Daniel's mouth opened, closed again. Talbot looked physically ill now. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because Richard Talbot wasn't the villain here. He was a lawyer who walked into court believing he represented a bitter inheritance dispute between siblings. Instead, he discovered he might be sitting beside financial fraud. There's a difference. A dangerous one. Dad leaned forward slowly. What loan? Daniel's irritation flared immediately. Dad, I told you already it was for the business. What business? Judge Holloway asked. Daniel hesitated. The marina expansion. I nearly smiled. There never was a marina expansion. Just another failed investment Daniel tried hiding from the family. Over the years, my brother cycled through business ideas the way some people cycle through diets. Boat repair, landscaping, vending machines, used RV sales. Every single one collapsed under debt. And every collapse somehow became somebody else's fault. Bad economy, bad partners, bad timing. Never Daniel. Never his gambling. Never the quiet loans. Never the missing money. Mom covered for him most of her life because she couldn't bear conflict. Dad covered for him because he believed sons deserved second chances longer than daughters did. But age changes things, especially desperation. I looked at the judge again. Your Honor, I'd also entered into evidence county tax payment records for the property over the last 4 years. Talbot rubbed his forehead hard. Daniel muttered, oh my God. The bailiff handed the documents to Judge Holloway. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. These payments came from your personal account, Ms. Whitaker. Yes. Dad stared at me. You paid the taxes. I nodded once. Daniel jumped in immediately. She only did that to manipulate Mom. I turned toward him slowly. No, Daniel. I did it because the county was preparing lien notices. That landed hard. Dad's face strained. What? The old man looked genuinely shaken now. I hated seeing it. No matter how angry I'd been over the years, he was still my father. And old age makes betrayal look crueler somehow. Especially when confusion enters the picture. Judge Holloway's tone sharpened. Mr. Whitaker, was your father aware the property faced tax delinquency concerns? Daniel avoided eye contact. It wasn't serious. But it had been serious. Very serious. I remembered the exact night I discovered it. Mom had called me around 11:30. Her voice sounded weak. Nervous. Margaret, she whispered, could you check something for me? I sat up immediately in bed. What's wrong? I found a letter from the county. The next morning I drove 2 hours to Fairfax and went straight to the records office. That's when I learned portions of the property taxes had gone unpaid for nearly 18 months. Not because Mom forgot, because somebody redirected money. I knew immediately who that somebody was, but proving it quietly without humiliating Dad became the problem. So I paid the overdue amount myself. Nearly $16,000. I never told anyone. Not even Frank's old friends from the Coast Guard support group I occasionally met for coffee. You know something strange about getting older. You stop keeping score. At least healthy people do. You help because somebody has to. That's all. The courtroom door opened quietly as a clerk brought additional files to the judge's bench. Outside the windows, gray November rain streaked across the courthouse parking lot. Everything suddenly felt smaller, older, sadder. Judge Holloway reviewed the records for several long moments before looking toward Daniel again. Mr. Whitaker, he said carefully, did your mother personally authorize these financial transfers? Yes. Do you possess documentation beyond your own submitted statements? Daniel swallowed. Talbot finally spoke up. Your Honor, my client may require time to organize supplementary records. That was lawyer language for we have a problem. A serious one. Dad looked back and forth between us like a man waking from anesthesia. Slowly, painfully. I don't understand, he murmured. And right then I realized something terrible. Dad truly didn't know. For months I'd convinced myself he knowingly helped Daniel turn against me. But sitting there watching confusion spread across his face, I saw something different. Loneliness. Old age terrifies people in ways younger folks don't fully understand. Once your spouse dies, the world becomes unstable. You start depending on whoever stays closest. Daniel understood that, and he used it. He became Dad's driver, Dad's helper, Dad's daily company. Not because he loved responsibility, because proximity creates influence, especially with elderly parents. The judge looked toward me again. Ms. Whitaker, do you possess further evidence regarding financial irregularities? I hesitated briefly, then opened the final folder. Inside was a handwritten letter. Mom's handwriting. Weak but recognizable. The second Dad saw the envelope, his breathing changed. Oh no, he whispered. Daniel's face hardened immediately. Where did you get that? Mom had mailed it to me 3 weeks before she died. Certified mail. No return address. Inside was only one handwritten sentence on the front page. If anything happens, read this in court. I'd carried that letter in my bag for months without opening it again. Partly because I already knew what it contained. Partly because I was afraid hearing Mom's voice one last time might break something inside me I couldn't repair. Judge Holloway accepted the envelope carefully. Is this relevant to the financial allegations? I looked toward my father, then my brother, then finally the judge. Yes, Your Honor. Daniel stood suddenly. That letter shouldn't be admitted. The room froze. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed slightly. And why is that, Mr. Whitaker? For the first time all day? Daniel looked afraid. Daniel remained standing. That letter shouldn't be admitted. Nobody in the courtroom moved. Judge Holloway folded his hands slowly. And why exactly would that be, Mr. Whitaker? Daniel opened his mouth, then hesitated. Talbot quietly touched his sleeve. Sit down, the attorney whispered. Daniel ignored him. That letter was written while my mother was confused. The judge glanced toward me. Ms. Whitaker, I answered calmly. My mother mailed it certified 3 weeks before her death. The judge examined the envelope carefully. The certification stamp was still visible near the corner. Dated. Verified. Real. Talbot finally spoke in a tired voice. Your Honor, perhaps we should review the contents privately before reading anything into public record. That alone told me everything. Richard Talbot no longer trusted his own client. Judge Holloway nodded once. I agree. He opened the envelope carefully. The paper inside looked fragile with age and handling. I recognized Mom's stationery immediately. Pale blue flowers around the edges. She'd used those letters for years. Christmas notes, birthday cards, recipes nobody in the family bothered learning properly. Funny what survives people. The judge adjusted his glasses and began reading silently. At first his expression stayed neutral. Then slowly, it changed. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just heavy, like a man carrying unexpected weight. Dad noticed too. What does it say? He asked quietly. Judge Holloway looked up. Mr. Whitaker, I believe this letter concerns all parties involved. I intend to admit it into record. Daniel's face tightened. You can't seriously. I can, the judge interrupted calmly. That shut him up. The courtroom air felt different now. Earlier there had been tension. Now there was dread. Judge Holloway began reading aloud. To whoever reads this, if Margaret brings this letter to court one day, it means things became worse than I feared. Dad lowered his head slowly. I felt my chest tighten hearing Mom's words again. Her voice returned instantly inside my memory. Soft Virginia accent, careful pacing, gentle even when angry. The judge continued, Daniel has been handling more of our finances since my health declined. I wanted to believe he was helping. But over time I became frightened to ask questions. Daniel stared at the table. Talbot closed his eyes briefly. I discovered money missing from accounts your father knew nothing about. When I confronted Daniel, he became angry and blamed stress from business troubles. Dad looked at his son. What is she talking about? Daniel didn't answer. The judge kept reading. I should have addressed this sooner, but after 58 years of marriage, I know your father. He avoids conflict when it involves family, especially Daniel. That one hit hard. Because it was true. Dad had spent his entire life pretending problems disappeared if ignored long enough. Sometimes that works with neighbors, not with children. Judge Holloway's voice softened slightly as he continued. Margaret may seem distant to people who don't understand her life, but distance is not abandonment. I swallowed carefully. The room remained completely still. Her work required silence. More silence than most families could tolerate. But she served this country honorably for decades while expecting nothing in return from any of us. Dad's hands began trembling. She missed holidays because duty called her away. She missed birthdays because other families needed their sons and daughters protected too. I looked down at my folded coat resting beside me. Suddenly I remembered another courtroom. Different year, different building. A military contractor hearing involving missing navigation equipment during the Gulf War buildup. 3 straight days awake. 2 sailors nearly killed because somebody altered procurement records. That investigation changed my career permanently. But while I sat in secure rooms halfway across the world, my family back home simply thought Margaret skipped Thanksgiving again. Invisible sacrifice. Frank was right. People rarely understand what they cannot see. The judge continued reading Mom's letter. I am writing this because I fear resentment has poisoned my family. Your father never forgave Margaret for leaving home. Daniel quietly learned to use that pain. Dad suddenly covered his mouth with one shaking hand. The old man looked destroyed, not angry. Destroyed. And for the first time since Mom died, my own anger weakened a little. Because grief changes elderly people differently. Younger people burn hot. Older people collapse inward. Judge Holloway paused before reading the next section. I also need the truth known clearly. Margaret secretly paid overdue taxes on this property after Daniel failed to do so. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Dad stared directly at Daniel now. You told me taxes were handled. Daniel snapped immediately. I was trying to fix it. With what money, I asked quietly. He glared at me. And suddenly I saw it. Not arrogance. Panic. Pure panic. People like Daniel survive through momentum. As long as nobody stops them, they keep spinning stories faster than others can question them. But once truth enters the room, everything collapses quickly. Judge Holloway resumed reading. I love both my children, but love without honesty destroys families slowly. Daniel needs help, not excuses. That line broke something inside Dad. He bent forward suddenly, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands. I had not seen my father cry since his own father died in 1972. Not at funerals. Not after heart surgery. Not even after Mom passed. But now quiet tears slipped through his fingers inside that courtroom. Nobody looked away. Even Daniel seemed shaken seeing it. The judge finished the final paragraph softly. If this family still has a chance after I am gone, it will only happen when truth becomes more important than pride. Silence filled the room again. Heavy silence. The kind older people understand well. The silence after hospitals, after funerals, after marriages fail quietly. Judge Holloway folded the letter carefully and removed his glasses. Dad finally looked up at me. His eyes were red. I didn't know he whispered. 3 simple words. But after 40 years of distance, they felt enormous. Daniel stood abruptly. She manipulated Mom into writing that. But even he sounded uncertain now. Talbot spoke before anyone else could. Daniel, stop talking. No, Mr. Whitaker. No professional distance anymore. Just exhausted honesty. Daniel stared at his own attorney in disbelief. What? Talbot rubbed his face slowly. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. You never told me about the taxes. Daniel said nothing. You never told me about refinancing against the property either. Still silence. And you definitely never mentioned a handwritten statement from your mother warning about financial misconduct. Dad looked at Daniel like he no longer recognized him. The old man's entire body seemed smaller somehow, fragile. Judge Holloway leaned forward carefully. Mr. Whitaker, I strongly advise complete honesty from this point forward. Daniel finally looked at me, not smug, not superior, just cornered. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, my brother looked afraid of me. Daniel looked trapped. That was the only word for it. Not angry anymore, not confident. Trapped. The courtroom that had once felt so comfortably under his control had turned into something dangerous. Every pair of eyes now watched him the same way people watch a bridge after hearing the first crack. Carefully, cautiously. Judge Holloway folded his hands together. Mr. Whitaker, he said calmly, this court is now concerned about possible financial misrepresentation involving estate assets and property liabilities. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. You're blowing this out of proportion. Talbot gave a dry laugh under his breath. That surprised even me, because lawyers like Richard Talbot usually protected appearances until the bitter end. But not anymore. Not once he realized he'd been dragged into something ugly. Daniel Talbot said quietly, "Stop treating this like an argument at a family barbecue." My brother stared at him. "You're supposed to be on my side." "I'm your attorney," Talbot replied, "not your accomplice." That landed hard. Dad looked physically sick. The old man's hands trembled against the wooden bench beside him. Suddenly he looked every bit of his 86 years. I hated that part most. Not the lawsuit. Not the humiliation. Watching age collide with betrayal. There's something deeply cruel about elderly people discovering the people they trusted most have lied to them, especially when grief already weakened them first. Judge Holloway turned toward Daniel again. "I'll ask directly. Did you use portions of the family property as collateral for personal business debt without fully informing your father?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "It was temporary." "That is not the question." Silence. Finally, "Yes." Dad inhaled sharply, like someone punched him. The judge continued. "Did your mother express concerns regarding missing funds before her death?" Daniel looked toward the ceiling briefly, then nodded once. "Yes." Dad whispered, "Oh my God." I closed my eyes for a moment. Not from satisfaction, from exhaustion. Because the truth is, I never wanted this moment. People imagine revenge feels triumphant. Most of the time it just feels sad, especially inside families. Judge Holloway's voice remained steady. "And did you knowingly allow this court to proceed under allegations that your sister manipulated your mother financially?" Daniel snapped immediately. "She did manipulate her." "How?" "She turned Mom against me." There it was. Not money. Not inheritance. The real wound. Judge Holloway leaned back slightly. "How exactly?" Daniel looked at me for the first time in several minutes, and suddenly years of bitterness came pouring out of him. "She always acted better than everyone else." I said nothing. "She leaves town, joins the military, disappears for decades, and suddenly everybody treats her like some hero." Dad looked stunned hearing him say it aloud. But I wasn't surprised. I'd heard versions of it my whole life. Daniel stood slowly. His voice cracked now with something deeper than anger. "You know what it was like growing up here after she left?" Nobody answered. "She got letters from officers and commanders and government people. Mom framed her Navy photos in the hallway like she was some celebrity." His breathing became uneven. "And me," he laughed bitterly. "I was just the son who stayed home." Talbot watched silently. Even the judge allowed him to continue. "Because sometimes courts accidentally become confessionals." Daniel pointed toward me. "She comes home after years away and everybody suddenly forgets who actually took care of Mom and Dad." "You stole from them," I said quietly. That stopped him cold. His face twisted instantly. "I borrowed money." "You refinanced their property behind Dad's back." "I was trying to save the business." "What business?" I asked calmly. "The marina that never existed." The room fell silent again. Dad looked at Daniel with genuine confusion now. There was no marina. Daniel avoided his eyes. That hurt the old man worse than anything else. You could see it happen, not because of the money, because parents can survive disappointment easier than humiliation. And suddenly Dad realized he'd defended lies publicly. Judge Holloway reviewed several papers before speaking again. "Mr. Whitaker, based on current evidence, this court finds no support for your allegations against your sister. However, substantial concerns now exist regarding your own conduct." Daniel sat heavily in his chair, defeated. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked small. Not evil, not monstrous. Just broken in ordinary human ways. That's the thing people eventually learn about family conflict. Most villains are simply wounded people who chose bitterness too long. Judge Holloway continued. I am referring portions of these financial findings for additional civil review. Dad lowered his head again. Daniel looked terrified now. Wait. But the judge raised one hand. However, everybody looked up. I also recognize this matter involves significant family grief, elder dependency concerns, and long-standing emotional conflict. The judge looked toward me. Ms. Whitaker, do you wish to pursue maximum civil penalties available under the current evidence? The courtroom became perfectly still. Talbot looked surprised. Daniel looked terrified. Dad looked ashamed. And me, I looked at my brother. Really looked at him. Past the arrogance. Past the lies. Past the resentment. I saw the little boy who used to wait on the front porch for me after school because bullies picked on him in 5th grade. I saw the teenager who cried privately after our dog died. I saw the man who never truly became comfortable in his own skin after spending his whole life comparing himself to someone else. Bitterness had rotted him slowly. But underneath it, he was still family. I took a slow breath. Then I answered, No, Your Honor. Daniel blinked. Talbot stared at me. Even Judge Holloway looked surprised. I folded my hands quietly. My mother wanted the truth known, I said, not destruction. Dad started crying again, openly this time. No attempt to hide it. The sound nearly broke my heart. Daniel looked at me with total confusion. Why would you do that? He whispered. Because despite everything, I was tired. Tired of funerals, tired of resentment, tired of old wounds surviving longer than love. I looked at him steadily. Because somebody in this family needs to stop the bleeding. Nobody spoke after that. Not for a long time. Then finally Daniel lowered his eyes, and for the first time since childhood, my brother could not look me in the face. 3 weeks after the court hearing, the Chesapeake Bay finally started looking like winter. The water outside my house turned gray and restless. Wind pushed dead leaves across the porch every morning, and the air smelled like cold salt and wood smoke drifting from neighboring homes. Life became quiet again. The lawsuit ended faster than most people expected. Daniel withdrew the remaining claims after his attorney negotiated revised financial disclosures with the county. Judge Holloway's findings stayed on record, but because I refused harsher penalties, the matter avoided turning into criminal prosecution. That decision confused many people, including Daniel, including myself sometimes, but at my age, peace starts mattering more than victory, especially after funerals, especially after losing almost everyone who once knew you young. I spent most mornings sitting near the bay with coffee and old photo albums I hadn't opened in years. Photos from Norfolk, photos from Gulf deployments, photos of Frank standing beside Coast Guard vessels with that crooked grin I still missed every day. One morning I found an old picture of myself in uniform from 1993. Sharp posture, dark hair, eyes that still believed hard work could fix everything. I stared at it for a long time, then laughed quietly to myself. That woman had no idea how lonely service could become later in life. People thank veterans in airports now, that's kind. But they rarely understand the invisible part afterward. The missed birthdays, the emotional distance, the marriages that survive through sacrifice, the families that quietly drift away while duty keeps pulling you somewhere else. Service leaves marks nobody sees, and silence leaves marks too. Around noon that same day, somebody knocked on my front door. I already knew who it was before opening it. Dad. He stood there wearing his old brown jacket and holding a grocery bag for absolutely no reason except nervousness. Old men from his generation always needed something in their hands during emotional moments. Thought maybe you needed soup, he muttered. I stepped aside quietly. Come in. He moved slower than I remembered. The courtroom seemed to age him 10 years in one afternoon. Or maybe truth simply removes the last illusions people use to stay young. We sat at the kitchen table overlooking the bay. For nearly 2 full minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Dad looked out the window and sighed. Your mother loved this view. Yes. Another silence. Then I was hard on you. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just honest. I stirred my coffee slowly. You were. Dad nodded weakly. I thought if you left home, eventually you'd forget us. That hit harder than I expected. Because suddenly so many old arguments finally made sense. Not anger. Fear. Parents from his generation rarely admitted fear directly, especially fathers. Instead, it came out sideways. Criticism, distance, pride. I never forgot, I said quietly. Dad rubbed his arthritic hands together. I know that now. The old man looked around my kitchen carefully. Framed photos, navy plaques packed away quietly near the bookshelf. Frank's old Coast Guard cap hanging beside the door. You really did all that stuff, he asked softly. I almost smiled. What stuff? All those years overseas, security work, investigations. A little. Dad shook his head slowly. You never talked about it. I wasn't supposed to. Another long silence settled between us. But this one felt gentler. Healing silence. Not hostile silence. Finally, Dad asked something he'd never asked me in 40 years. Were you scared? I looked down at my coffee cup. Sometimes. Not during emergencies, not during investigations. Oddly enough, training handles those moments. The fear comes later. Hotels alone at night. Phone calls you can't return. Watching young sailors pretend they aren't terrified before deployment. And funerals. So many funerals. Yes, I answered honestly, sometimes. Dad nodded slowly like he was finally meeting his daughter for the first time. I'm sorry, he whispered. Simple words. Late words. But real. At our age, real matters more than perfect. The knock at the door came unexpectedly around 20 minutes later. Dad looked confused. I didn't bring anybody. I stood and opened the door slowly. Daniel stood outside, hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. The courtroom had stripped something out of him too. For a moment nobody spoke. Then he looked at Dad. I almost drove away 3 times. Dad gave a tired half laugh. Probably should've. Daniel nodded slightly. Maybe. I stepped aside. Come in. The 3 of us sat awkwardly around the kitchen table like strangers trapped together during a snowstorm, which honestly described most families after enough years pass. Daniel stared down at his hands. I messed everything up. Nobody interrupted him. That business debt got worse than I told anybody. He swallowed hard. After Mom got sick. I panicked. Dad closed his eyes painfully. You lied to me. I know. You stole from us. Daniel nodded once. I know. Then finally he looked at me. I hated you for leaving. The honesty in his voice surprised me. I know, I said quietly. You always seemed stronger than me. I almost laughed at that, because strength is one of the biggest misunderstandings in American families. People think strength means confidence. Sometimes strength is simply enduring loneliness without becoming cruel. Daniel rubbed his face. When people talked about you, it made me feel small. I studied him carefully. Not the angry brother from court, not the manipulative son. Just an aging man carrying decades of insecurity badly, and suddenly I felt tired of punishing him in my own mind. Dad slowly stood from the table and wandered toward the hallway. My old navy coat still hung beside the closet door where I'd left it earlier that morning. The room became quiet again as he stared at it. Then something happened I never expected. Dad straightened his posture carefully despite the arthritis, raised his trembling hand, and gave me the first salute of my life. I couldn't speak. Neither could Daniel. The old man's eyes filled with tears. I should have done that years ago, he whispered. Nobody moved for several seconds. Then finally I stood and hugged my father. And after a moment, my brother too. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. Some damage never disappears completely. But healing begins the moment pride stops speaking louder than love. And maybe that's the real tragedy of growing older. Not wrinkles. Not illness. Not even death. It's realizing how many years people waste misunderstanding each other. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of somebody you still need to call forgive or simply understand a little better, then maybe it was worth telling. And if you believe quiet strength still matters in this world, I hope you'll stay for more stories like this. At the will, reading my dad declared the penthouse and Tesla go to your brother, not you. I didn't blink. I didn't argue. I just folded my hands in my lap, looked him straight in the eye and said calm as still water. Keep it all. A few people in the room shifted in their seats. Someone near the back let out a quiet, confused laugh like they weren't sure if they'd heard me right. My brother leaned back smiling. Not a cruel smile. Not exactly. Just satisfied. Like everything had finally fallen into place the way it was always supposed to. My father nodded once as if my response confirmed something he had believed about me for years. She understands, he said, glancing toward the attorney. She's always been independent. Independent. That was the word he used. Not overlooked, not dismissed, not forgotten. Independent. I could feel the weight of every eye in that room pressing against me, extended family neighbors, 2 of my father's business associates, and a couple of people I didn't even recognize. They were all waiting for something. A reaction. A crack. But I had learned a long time ago how to hold still when everything inside me was shifting. They thought I'd lost my mind. They didn't know I'd already won. My father adjusted his tie, the same small, precise motion he'd made my entire life whenever he felt in control of a situation. He glanced down at the document in front of him, then at the attorney. Well, he said almost casually, that should settle everything. The attorney didn't answer right away. He was an older man, mid-60s, maybe thin, careful with a voice that always sounded like it had something more behind it than what he actually said. He flipped a page. Paused. Then he cleared his throat. Mr. Whitaker, he said, measured and professional, there is an additional document your father left behind. The room changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. My brother's smile faltered just slightly. My father frowned. What do you mean, he asked. The attorney adjusted his glasses. A separate directive. It was filed independently and is to be read after the primary will. There was a silence then. The kind that doesn't come from confusion but from something deeper. Something people don't quite understand yet but feel shifting under their feet. I sat there, hands still folded, breathing steady. Because I knew. Or at least I suspected. And for the first time that morning, I allowed myself to remember his voice. You don't need their approval, my grandfather had told me once. Just become someone they can't ignore. I'm 35 years old. A commissioned officer in the United States Navy. I've spent most of my adult life away from this town, away from this house, this table, these conversations that always seemed to circle around things I was never quite part of. My brother stayed. He built a business with my father, expanded it, made it profitable. He was visible. He was present. He was understandable. I wasn't. When I left for the military, my father didn't stop me. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just said, if that's what you want. And that was it. No pride. No concern. Just quiet acceptance, as if I'd chosen something temporary, something that would eventually pass. It never did. My grandfather was the only one who ever asked me why. Not in a demanding way, not like he was trying to test me. He asked because he wanted to understand. We used to sit on his back porch in the late afternoons when the sun dipped low enough to soften everything. He'd pour 2 glasses of iced tea too sweet for my taste, but I never said anything and we'd talk. You ever notice he said once how people respect what they can see? I nodded. They see your brother's office, his car, his numbers. That makes sense to them. He tapped the side of his glass lightly. But service, that's harder. It doesn't show up in the same way. I remember looking at him then, trying to decide if he was warning me or encouraging me. What if they never see it, I asked. He smiled, not a big smile, just something small and certain. Then you make sure it's worth it anyway. The day I told my family I was enlisting, my brother laughed. Not harshly, just surprised. You, he said, you're serious. My father didn't laugh. He just leaned back in his chair, studying me like I was a problem he hadn't quite figured out yet. It's a hard life, he said. I know. You'll be gone most of the time. I know. He nodded once. Then he looked past me toward the window. Well, he said, it's your decision. That was the moment I understood something I didn't have words for yet. I wasn't stepping away from them. I had never really been standing where they were to begin with. My grandfather drove me to the recruiter's office. He didn't say much on the way, just kept both hands steady on the wheel, eyes forward. When we pulled into the parking lot, he reached into his jacket and pulled out an old watch. It wasn't expensive, you could tell that just by looking at it. But it was clean, maintained, cared for. This was mine, he said. Wore it for 30 years. I hesitated. I can't take that. He pressed it into my hand anyway. You're not taking it, he said. You're carrying it. I looked down at it, then back at him. Why me? He held my gaze for a moment. Because you understand the difference. Years passed. Deployments came and went, promotions, 2 quiet ones earned the long way. I missed holidays, birthdays, dinners that from what I heard later weren't much different without me. I sent money home sometimes, not because they asked, just because it felt like something you do for family. No one ever mentioned it. My father would talk about my brother's latest expansion, his new clients, his plans. When he spoke about me, it was usually brief. She's doing fine, he'd say. Fine. The last time I spoke to my grandfather, I was standing outside a base in Virginia, the wind cutting sharp across the pavement. He sounded tired. But clear. How are you holding up, he asked. I'm good, I said, just busy. He chuckled softly. Busy's a good thing. There was a pause. Then he said something I didn't expect. I'm proud of you. I closed my eyes for a second. Thank you, I said. We talked a little longer, nothing important, just small things. When the call ended, I told myself I'd call him back in a few days. I didn't. By the time I did, it was too late. I didn't make it home for his funeral. Duty didn't allow it. That's the phrase they use. As if it explains everything. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. A week later, I received a letter. Handwritten. Short. Stand tall, even when no one's watching. That was all it said. No signature. It didn't need one. Now I was sitting in that same town again. In a room full of people who had never quite known what to do with me. Listening to my father distribute everything he believed mattered. And realizing he hadn't changed. Not really. But maybe he was about to. Because the attorney was still holding that second document. And for the first time in a very long time, my father looked uncertain. I didn't move when the attorney lifted the second document. For a moment, no one did. It was a strange kind of stillness, like the air had shifted but hadn't quite settled yet. My father's hand rested flat against the table, fingers spread just slightly as if grounding himself in something solid. "What is that?" he asked. His voice wasn't sharp, it wasn't demanding. It was unfamiliar. The attorney glanced down, then back up. "This," he said carefully, "is a separate directive filed by your father, Mr. Whitaker. It is to be read in full without interruption." My brother let out a quiet breath through his nose, almost amused again, trying to recover that earlier confidence. "Well," he said lightly, "I guess Grandpa had one more thing to say." No one laughed this time. I kept my eyes on the attorney's hands. The way he handled the paper, slow, deliberate, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't an afterthought. This mattered. My grandfather never rushed anything. Not conversations, not decisions, not even silence. Especially not silence. He used to say that silence was where people showed you who they really were when they weren't trying to fill the space. We spent a lot of those silences together. On his porch, in his truck, sitting side by side watching the world move without feeling the need to explain it. "You ever notice," he said once, "how most people talk so they won't have to think?" I smiled. "You talk less than anyone I know." "That's because I already did my thinking," he said. He was a quiet man. Worked with his hands most of his life, fixed things, built things, took care of what was his without making a show of it. When I was a kid, I thought that meant he didn't have much. It took me years to realize he had more than anyone else in that family. He just didn't measure it the same way. The attorney unfolded the paper. "Before I begin," he said, "I need to clarify that this directive establishes a trust and outlines specific responsibilities assigned by the decedent." My father straightened. "A trust," he repeated. "Yes, sir." My brother leaned forward slightly, now interest replacing ease. "What kind of trust?" he asked. The attorney didn't answer right away. Instead, he began to read. "I, Thomas Whitaker, being of sound mind." The words were formal, legal, structured. But beneath them, if you knew how to listen, there was something else. Something human. I remembered the first time my grandfather showed me how to fix a broken hinge. I must have been 10. He didn't take the tool from my hand when I struggled, didn't step in when I got frustrated. He just stood there beside me. "You'll get it," he said. "I'm doing it wrong," I snapped. He shook his head. "You're doing it your way, that's different." I tried again. Slower this time. When it finally worked, I looked up at him, waiting. He nodded once. "That's it. No applause, no big reaction. Just recognition." And somehow, that meant more. "This trust is to be named the Whitaker Service Fund." There was a small shift in the room. Not loud, not dramatic, but noticeable. My brother's brow furrowed. My father's expression tightened. "Its purpose shall be to provide financial assistance and support to veterans and their families." Someone near the back whispered something under their breath. I didn't turn to see who. With an emphasis on those who have served without recognition or adequate support upon return to civilian life. My throat tightened slightly. Not from surprise. From understanding. He never talked about his own service. Not really. I knew he'd served, knew he'd seen things he didn't share. But he never wore it like a badge. He carried it like something private. Something earned but not displayed. "The management and full discretionary control of this trust shall be granted to my granddaughter." The attorney paused. Just for a second. Then he looked up. Emily Whitaker. Every head in the room turned. I didn't move. Didn't react. But I could feel it, that shift. The one I'd felt my whole life just reversed. My brother blinked. "Wait," he said. "What?" My father didn't speak. He was looking at me now. Really looking? For the first time in a long time. This decision is made with full confidence in her judgment, character, and understanding of service. The attorney continued, his voice steady. Qualities which I have observed consistently throughout her life. I closed my eyes briefly. Just for a second. Because I could hear it. Not the attorney's voice. His. "You don't need them to understand," my grandfather had told me once. We were sitting in his truck that day, rain tapping softly against the windshield. "You just need to understand yourself." "What if that's not enough?" I asked. He looked at me calm as ever. "It will be," he said, "eventually. Along with the trust, I leave a personal letter to be read aloud at this time." The attorney lowered the document slightly, then reached for a second page. My father shifted in his seat. "This is unnecessary," he said quietly. The attorney didn't respond. He just began to read. "If you are hearing this, then I am gone. And if I know this family the way I believe I do, then there is already a misunderstanding in the room." A few people exchanged glances. My brother leaned back again, but there was no smile now. "I have watched each of you build your lives in your own way. Some of you have built with numbers, some with presence, and one of you," the attorney paused briefly, "has built with sacrifice." The room was silent. Completely silent. "Emily," he read, "you chose a path that does not always come with recognition. That is the nature of it." I felt something shift in my chest. Not pain. Not quite. Something older. Deeper. Your family may not always understand what you have given, not because they do not care, but because they measure differently. My father's jaw tightened. "I am leaving you this responsibility not as a burden, but as acknowledgement." The word hung there. Acknowledgement. "You have already proven that you do not need more to carry. What you deserve," a pause, "is to be seen." The attorney lowered the paper. No one spoke. No one moved. I kept my hands folded in my lap. Just like before. But something had changed. Not in the room. Not yet. But in the way they were looking at me. My brother exhaled slowly. "So, what she gets a charity," he said, trying to make sense of it. The attorney answered calmly. "She receives full control of a funded trust with significant assets." That landed differently. My father finally spoke. "How significant?" he asked. The attorney met his eyes. "Enough to matter." Silence again. But this time it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of something none of them had expected to face. I looked down at my hands. Then at the old watch on my wrist. Still ticking. Still steady. Just like he always was. And for the first time since I walked into that room, I realized something clearly. I hadn't just been given something. I had been recognized. The room didn't recover right away. It just sat there with what had been said. You could feel it settling into people differently, some trying to understand it, some trying to measure it, and a few trying to decide whether it mattered at all. My father was still looking at me. Not with anger, not even with disappointment. With something quieter. Something that didn't have a name yet. The attorney gathered the pages, aligning the edges carefully as if the order of things still mattered. "If there are no further questions," he said, "we can proceed with the formal transfer process in the coming weeks." My brother leaned forward. "I have a question," he said. Of course he did. "How is this funded?" he asked. "I mean, where is the money coming from?" The attorney met his gaze without hesitation. "Your grandfather allocated a portion of his private holdings to establish the trust," he said. "Investments, land interests, and several long-term accounts." My brother blinked. "That's not possible," he said. "We went over everything." "You reviewed the primary estate," the attorney replied. "This was structured separately." I could see it then, the moment my brother realized something had existed in that family that he hadn't been part of. Not excluded. Just never invited into. We left the house in small groups. People always do that after something uncomfortable. They don't leave all at once. They break apart quietly, like a gathering that no longer knows what it's supposed to be. A few relatives stopped me on the way out. Congratulations, one of them said, though it didn't quite sound like congratulations. That's something, another added, unsure of the word. I nodded politely. Thank you. That was enough. It always had been. The air outside felt different. Cooler, cleaner. I stood on the front steps for a moment, letting it settle. This house had never quite felt like mine. Even growing up, it had always belonged more to the idea of a family than to the people inside it. My brother's voice came from behind me. So he said. I turned. He had his hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly tense. That was unexpected, he added. It was, I said. He studied me for a second. You knew, he asked. I shook my head. Number. He frowned. But you didn't seem surprised. I considered that. I wasn't, I said. He looked away down the driveway. I don't get it, he said. Why you? There was no accusation in it. Just confusion. I could have given him an answer. Explained the years, the distance, the choices. But none of that would have made sense to him, not in the way he needed it to. So I just said you'd have to ask him. My brother let out a quiet breath. Yeah, he said. Guess I can't do that anymore. My father didn't come outside right away. I didn't expect him to. He was the kind of man who needed time not to feel something, but to understand what it meant. I walked down the steps and toward the driveway. My car was parked along the curb, same place it had been when I arrived that morning. Nothing about it had changed. And yet everything had. The drive back took me past the old roads I used to know by heart. The grocery store on the corner, the gas station where my grandfather used to stop every Friday. The small park where nothing ever seemed to happen but where everything felt remembered. I pulled over once. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. The watch on my wrist caught the light as I turned the steering wheel. Still ticking. Still steady. The first time I wore that watch on base, one of the younger officers noticed it. Nice piece, he said. Where'd you get it? My grandfather, I told him. He nodded, impressed. Looks old. It is. He smiled. Still works, though. I looked down at it. Yeah, I said, it does. Military life isn't what most people think it is. It's not constant action. It's not glory. It's routine. Responsibility. Long stretches of quiet work that no one ever hears about. You wake up early, you follow orders, you lead when it's your turn, you take care of the people under you. And you learn over time that recognition isn't part of the job description. That's not why you do it. But there are moments, small ones, when someone looks at you, not for what you rank, not for what you've done on paper, but for how you carry yourself. Those moments stay with you. They build something, not visible, but real. I remember one deployment where things didn't go the way they were supposed to. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone would write about. Just a situation that required someone to stay steady when others couldn't. After it was over, one of the enlisted men came up to me. Ma'am, he said, thank you. For what I asked. He shrugged. For not making it worse. I almost laughed. But I didn't. Because I understood what he meant. Sometimes doing your job well means not adding to the problem. Sometimes that's enough. My family never saw those moments. They didn't see the long hours, the quiet decisions, the responsibility that didn't come with applause. They saw absence, distance, a life they couldn't measure. I didn't blame them. Not really. You can't expect someone to value what they don't understand. But my grandfather did. He didn't need to see everything. He just needed to know who I was. I drove a little farther before pulling into a small parking lot near the edge of town. There was a bench there overlooking a stretch of open field that hadn't changed in years. I sat down. For the first time that day, I let myself exhale fully. The trust. The letter. The way the room had shifted. It wasn't about winning. Not in the way they thought. I hadn't taken anything from them. I hadn't proven them wrong. Not directly. But something had changed. Something quiet. Something that couldn't be undone. I took the letter out of my bag. The one the attorney had handed me after everything ended. I hadn't read it again yet. Not properly. I unfolded it carefully. The paper felt different in my hands than it had in that room. More personal. More real. Emily, it began. No formal tone this time. Just my name. You may not realize it yet, But the life you chose has already shaped more people than you will ever meet. I paused there. Let it settle. There will be times when it feels like no one is watching, like what you do doesn't reach beyond the moment. I looked out across the field. The wind moved through the grass in slow, steady waves. But impact is not always visible, and recognition is not always immediate. I swallowed. What matters is that you continue anyway. I folded the letter slowly, held it for a moment, then placed it back in my bag. The sun was starting to lower, casting long shadows across the ground. I stood up, took one last look at the field, then walked back to my car, because whatever came next, it wasn't about what I had been given. It was about what I was going to do with it. I didn't go back to the house that evening. There wasn't anything there I needed. Not anymore. Instead, I checked into a small hotel just off the highway, the kind with faded carpet, quiet hallways, and a front desk clerk who barely looked up when you walked in. It was the same place I'd stayed a few times over the years when visits home didn't quite feel like coming home. Some things don't change. And sometimes that's a relief. I set my bag down on the chair by the window. The room smelled faintly of old air conditioning and detergent. Outside, the sky was turning that soft gray blue that comes just before night settles in. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, still in my uniform, hands resting on my knees. The silence didn't feel heavy. Just honest. There's a kind of quiet you learn to live with in the military. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of distraction. You learn to sit with your thoughts. You learn not to run from them. And eventually you learn which ones matter. That night only one thought stayed. Not about the trust. Not about the will. But about something my father had said years ago, something I hadn't thought about in a long time. You don't need anything from us. At the time I had taken it as dismissal. A quiet way of saying I wasn't part of what they were building. But now, sitting there alone, I realized something different. He hadn't meant to push me away. He had simply placed me somewhere else. Somewhere he didn't know how to reach. The next morning I woke early. Old habits don't fade. I got dressed, checked out, and drove back toward town, not to the house, but to the one place that had always made sense to me. My grandfather's. It was smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was just seeing it clearly for the first time. The paint had faded along the edges of the porch. The railing leaned slightly where it always had. The yard was still neat, though someone had been taking care of it. I parked along the side and walked up the steps. They creaked in the same places. I noticed that. I always noticed things like that. The front door was locked. Of course it was. But I didn't try to open it. I just stood there for a moment looking at it. Remembering. He used to leave it unlocked during the day. Said there was no reason to keep people out if you weren't afraid of anything inside. I never knew if that was wisdom or just the way he chose to live. Maybe both. I walked around to the back. The porch was still there, same 2 chairs, same small table between them. One of the chairs had a slight tilt to it, the one he always sat in. I stepped onto the porch and sat down. The wood creaked under my weight. For a second it felt like nothing had changed. I figured you'd come here. I turned. My father stood at the edge of the yard. Hands at his sides, no jacket, no tie. Just him. I wasn't sure if you would, I said. He nodded once. I wasn't sure either. He took a few steps closer, then stopped, not quite ready to come all the way up. We stood there like that for a moment. The distance between us wasn't large, but it felt familiar. I didn't know about the trust, he said. I know. He looked at the porch, then at me. He never mentioned it. I nodded. He didn't mention a lot of things. My father exhaled slowly. That's not how I do things. No, I said, it's not. He stepped closer this time. 1 foot on the first step, but no further. I thought I understood him, he said. I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure what that would sound like. I thought I understood you too, he added. That got my attention. I looked at him. Really looked. There was something different in his expression now. Not certainty. Not control. Something closer to doubt. I didn't think you needed anything, he said. There it was again. That same sentence. But it didn't sound the same anymore. I didn't, I said. He frowned slightly. Then why does this feel like I missed something? I held his gaze. Because you did. He didn't react right away. Didn't defend himself. Didn't argue. He just stood there letting that settle. I gave your brother what I thought mattered, he said after a moment. I know. And you, he paused, you chose something else. Yes. He nodded slowly. I thought that meant you were separate from all this. I glanced around the yard, the house, the porch. This was never really mine, I said. He looked at me confused. It was your home. It was your home, I corrected gently. And his. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. My father stepped up onto the porch, then finally closing the distance. He didn't sit. Just stood beside me, looking out at the yard the same way I was. I didn't know how to measure what you were doing, he admitted. That felt closer to the truth. You weren't supposed to, I said. He turned slightly. Then what was I supposed to do? I thought about that. Not quickly. Not easily. Ask, I said. He looked away. Toward the fence line. Toward the place where the yard met the open field beyond it. I thought giving you space was respect, he said. It can be, I replied. But not when it replaces understanding. He was quiet again. Longer this time. I watched your brother build something I could see, he said. And I watched you leave. I nodded. That's what it looked like. He let out a breath. But I never asked where you were going. That was it. That was the moment. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just clear. I didn't need more from you, I said after a while. He looked at me again. Then what did you need? I met his eyes. Not angry. Not hurt. Just honest. To be seen. The words stayed between us. Not heavy, but real. My father didn't answer right away. He just nodded. Once. Slowly. I see you now, he said. I didn't respond. Because that kind of thing, it doesn't come from words. It comes from what happens next. The wind moved through the yard again, brushing against the porch, carrying that same quiet I had always known here. My father looked around one more time. Then back at me. What are you going to do with it? He asked. I followed his gaze out toward the field. Toward something bigger than this house. This town. This moment. I'm going to use it, I said. And for the first time since I'd come back. That answer felt like mine. The paperwork began the following Monday. Not all at once, not dramatically, just a series of meetings, signatures, quiet conversations, the kind of work that builds something real without ever drawing attention to itself. I stayed in town longer than I'd planned. Not because I had to, but because this mattered. The attorney's office was smaller than I expected. Wood-paneled walls, old framed certificates, a desk that looked like it had held decades of decisions that didn't need to be explained to anyone else. He greeted me with a firm handshake. Ms. Whitaker, he said, I'm glad you came in. So am I replied. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Let's talk about what your grandfather left you. He didn't rush. That was the first thing I noticed. He explained everything carefully, how the trust had been built, where the funds were held, how the structure worked. It wasn't just a single account. It was layered. Planned. Intentional. Your grandfather began this nearly 10 years ago, he said. I looked up. Then, he nodded. Small at first, then consistent. He added to it regularly. I sat back slightly. 10 years. That meant he had started this long before his health declined, long before anyone thought about wills or estates. He had been building this quietly, while the rest of us were living our lives unaware. He never mentioned it, I said. The attorney smiled faintly. That seems consistent with what I knew of him. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were documents, detailed records, investment summaries, notes. But what caught my attention wasn't the numbers. It was the purpose. This isn't just a financial structure, he said. It's a mission. I nodded. I understand that. He studied me for a moment. I believe you do, he said. There were conditions, of course. Not restrictive ones. Guiding ones. The fund was designed to support veterans transitioning back into civilian life, especially those who didn't have strong family support. Housing assistance. Job training. Emergency support. Nothing excessive. Nothing showy. Just practical help. The kind that actually makes a difference. He was very clear about one thing, the attorney added. What's that? I asked. That this fund should never become performative. I almost smiled. That sounds like him. The meetings continued throughout the week. Account managers, advisors, a small board that had been quietly assembled. People who had known my grandfather in different ways, some from his past, some from his later years. All of them steady. No one treated me like an outsider. No one questioned why I was there. They simply included me. On Wednesday, we visited one of the properties tied to the trust, a modest building on the edge of town. Nothing impressive from the outside. But inside, it was already being used. A small group of veterans sat in a common room talking quietly. Coffee on the table, papers spread out. One of them looked up as we entered. Ma'am, he said, nodding. I nodded back. Morning. The attorney spoke with the coordinator, giving me space to observe. I noticed things. The way people sat. The way they held themselves. The small, almost invisible tension that comes from adjusting to a life that doesn't move the same way anymore. I recognized it. Because I had felt it. One of the men stood up and walked over. Mid-40s maybe, worn but not broken. You new here, he asked? I shook my head. Not exactly. He nodded like that made sense. Place helps, he said after a moment. How so, I asked. He shrugged. Gives you somewhere to land. Somewhere to land. I repeated that in my head. Because that was exactly what this was. Not a solution. Not a fix. Just a place to start again. Later that afternoon, the attorney handed me a set of finalized documents. This will formally transfer operational control to you, he said. I took them. Felt the weight of them. Not heavy. But significant. Are you ready for this, he asked. I looked at the pages. Then at him. I've been ready for a long time, I said. He nodded. I believe that. The signing itself was quiet. No audience. No announcement. Just a pen. A name. And a responsibility that had been waiting for me long before I knew it existed. When it was done, I sat there for a moment. Not moving. Not thinking. Just present. You understand, the attorney said gently, that this isn't something you complete. It's something you continue. I nodded. I know. He stood extending his hand. Then I think your grandfather chose well. That evening I drove back to the house. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. My father was in the living room when I walked in. No TV on. No papers in his hands. Just sitting there. You're still in town, he said. I am. He nodded. We didn't talk right away. Didn't need to. How did it go? He asked after a while. Good, I said. That's good. He looked at me then. Not quickly. Not casually. But with intention. What exactly is it? He asked. I thought about how to answer that. Not in terms he would expect, but in terms he could understand. It's support, I said. For people who don't always have it. He nodded slowly. And you're in charge of that now. Yes. Another pause. That's a lot of responsibility, he said. It is. He leaned back slightly, studying me again. But this time, there was no confusion. Your grandfather always believed in things I didn't fully understand, he said. I didn't respond. I just let him continue. I thought I was building something solid, he said. You were. He shook his head slightly. But I think he was building something lasting. That stayed with me. Because there's a difference between something that holds value and something that carries meaning. I think you're right, I said. He looked at me again, then nodded. And for the first time, there was no distance in it. The first real decision didn't come with a meeting. It came with a phone call. Late Thursday afternoon. I was still in town going over final notes with the coordinator from the center we'd visited earlier in the week. My phone rang. Unknown number. I stepped outside to take it. This is Whitaker, I said. There was a pause on the other end. Not hesitation, just someone deciding how to begin. Ma'am, a voice said, my name's Daniel Ruiz. I was given your number through the fund. I leaned slightly against the railing. Yes, Mr. Ruiz, how can I help? Another pause. I'm not sure, he said honestly. I was told, You might be able to point me in the right direction. That more than anything told me exactly where he was. We talked for about 15 minutes. He didn't tell me everything. People rarely do on the first call. But he told me enough. Former Army. Recently discharged. No steady housing. A job lined up, but it didn't start for another 3 weeks. He wasn't asking for much. Just time. I've got a place I can stay for a couple nights, he said. After that, I'm not sure. I looked out across the parking lot. Thought about the building we'd visited. The empty room I'd noticed near the back. You're in town, I asked. Yes, ma'am. Come by tomorrow morning, I said, 9 o'clock. Another pause. Are you sure, he asked? Yes. His voice softened slightly. Thank you. After the call ended, I stayed where I was for a moment. Not thinking about policy. Not thinking about structure. Just thinking about him. This was what my grandfather had built. Not a concept. Not an idea. A place where someone could call and not be turned away. The next morning I arrived early. Old habit. I walked through the building checking things not because I didn't trust the people there, but because I needed to understand how it felt when it was quiet. When it wasn't performing for anyone. Daniel arrived at 8:57. I noticed that. Clean clothes, worn boots, carried himself straight but with that same quiet tension I'd seen before. He hesitated slightly at the door. I walked over. Mr. Ruiz. He nodded. Yes, ma'am. Come on in. We sat down at a small table near the window. No paperwork yet. No forms. Just conversation. Tell me what you need, I said. He took a breath. Just somewhere to stay, he said. A couple weeks. I've got a job starting soon. I just need to get there. I nodded. You will. He looked at me unsure. You don't know that, he said. I met his gaze. Yes, I said, I do. We got him set up in less than an hour. Temporary housing, access to meals, a small stipend to bridge the gap. Nothing excessive. Everything necessary. As he was leaving the office, he paused. Turned back. I appreciate this, he said. You don't owe us anything, I replied. He shook his head slightly. Still, he said, it matters. After he left, I stood by the window for a while, watching him walk across the lot. Shoulders a little lighter. Steps a little more certain. That was the moment it became real. Not the signing. Not the documents. This. Later that afternoon, my brother called. I hadn't expected that. I answered anyway. Hey, he said. Hey. A pause. I've been thinking, he added. I figured. He let out a small breath. About everything, the will, the trust, all of it. I didn't interrupt. I didn't realize how much he had set aside, he said. He planned ahead, I replied. Yeah, he said, he did. Another pause. I got the penthouse, he said finally. And the Tesla. Yes. It's a lot, he said. It is. But it doesn't feel the way I thought it would. I didn't answer right away. Because I knew that feeling. What does it feel like, I asked. He hesitated. Like I got what I wanted, he said. But not what he meant. That was honest. More honest than I expected. He didn't choose against you, I said. I know, he replied quickly. I think I know. He chose based on what he believed each of us needed, I added. There was a long silence on the line. I don't know if I needed this, my brother said. You might, I said. Or you might learn something from it. He gave a quiet laugh. That sounds like something he would have said. It does, I agreed. Another pause. Then, what you're doing with that fund, he said, that's different. It is. I went by the building yesterday, he admitted. I raised an eyebrow slightly. You did? Yeah, I didn't go in, just looked. And I asked. I didn't understand it, he said. But I could tell it mattered. That was enough. You're welcome to come by, I said. He didn't answer right away. Maybe I will, he said finally. When the call ended, I set the phone down slowly. Things don't change all at once. Not people. Not families. But sometimes they start. That evening, I sat down at my desk in the small office at the center. The same one my grandfather had used. Simple, clean, functional. I opened a new folder. Labeled it. Not with my name. With the funds. because this wasn't about me. Not really. It was about continuing something that had already begun. And for the first time, I understood what winning actually meant. The first letter came 3 weeks later. Not an official report, not a document. Just a handwritten note folded neatly and left on my desk. I recognized the handwriting before I even opened it. Danielle Ruiz? Ma'am, I started the job this week. It's nothing fancy, warehouse work, early hours. But it's steady. I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for the place to stay. For not making me feel like I had to explain everything. That mattered more than I expected. Ruiz. I read it twice. Then I set it down gently. Not because it was fragile, but because it meant something. People don't always remember what you give them, but they remember how you make them feel while they're receiving it. My grandfather understood that. He never gave in a way that made you feel small. He gave in a way that made you feel steady. By the end of the month, we had helped 7 more. Not dramatic cases, not headlines. Just people in between chapters. A place to land. Time to reset. A quiet hand forward. Word spread the way things like that always do. Slowly. Through conversations. Through trust. One afternoon, a local reporter stopped by. Young, polite, curious. I heard about the fund, she said. Would you be willing to talk about it? I considered that. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew what my grandfather would have said. Keep it about the people it helps, I replied. She nodded. That's what I was hoping you'd say. The article ran the following Sunday. Simple. Respectful. Focused. It mentioned the fund, the purpose, a few anonymous stories. And at the end, my name. I didn't think much of it. Until my father called. I saw the paper, he said. Yeah. Yes. A pause. They used your name. They did. Another pause. I didn't know you were doing all of that, he said. I leaned back slightly in my chair. That's kind of the point, I said. He didn't answer right away. I showed it to a few people, he said. That caught my attention. You did? Yes. Another pause. I told them, you were my daughter. The words landed quietly. But they stayed. That's the first time you've said it like that, I said. I know, he replied. There was no defense in his voice. No justification. Just acknowledgement. I should have said it sooner, he added. I looked down at the desk. At the letter still resting there. You can say it now, I said. He exhaled softly. I'm proud of you, he said. The room didn't change. Nothing around me shifted. But something inside me did. Not sharply. Not dramatically. Just settled. Thank you, I said. We stayed on the line for a moment longer. Not talking. Just there. When the call ended, I sat there quietly. The same way I had so many times before. But this time the silence felt different. Not like something missing. Like something complete. A few days later, my brother showed up. No announcement. No call ahead. Just walked through the door of the center looking slightly out of place. I figured I'd come see it, he said. I nodded. Good. He walked slowly through the space. Taking it in. The chairs, the desks, the people. This is what you do now, he asked. This is part of it, I said. He nodded. I always thought success looked different, he admitted. It usually does, I said. We stopped near the window. The same one I had stood by weeks earlier. I used to think you left, he said. I glanced at him. I didn't leave, I said. I just went somewhere you weren't looking. He let out a quiet breath. Yeah, he said. I see that now. We stood there for a while. Not fixing anything? Not rewriting the past. Just understanding it better. That evening, after everyone had gone, I stayed behind. The building was quiet again. The way I preferred it. I sat at the desk. Opened my grandfather's letter one more time. Recognition is not always immediate. I smiled slightly. No, I said quietly. It isn't. I folded the letter carefully. Placed it back where it belonged. Then I looked around the room. At what had been built. At what was continuing. Some people leave money. Some leave property. Some leave things that can be counted, measured, divided. But some leave direction. A way forward. And sometimes, That's the only inheritance that truly lasts. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly carried more than anyone ever noticed, take a moment. Reach out. Tell them you see them. Because sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything.